Hi, everybody. So we're going to be doing cellular respiration today. So a firework explosion is a fast series of chemical reactions. The fuel is powdered charcoal or carbon that reacts with other chemicals such as potassium nitrate, KNO3, which results in an explosive reaction. When heat is added, the charcoal and other chemicals packed inside the firework casing combust. They burn and release heat. This reaction occurs very quickly, and it releases energy in the forms of heat and light, which is the explosion we see from the firework. So how is the process of combustion in firework similar to the way our cells release stored energy? Well, combustion is similar because the chemical bonds are broken, releasing energy just like our cells do when they release stored energy. Now, the fuel that is the material that reacts with other materials to release energy to be used for work, or something, right? Wood, peat, charcoal; those are all basic kinds of fuel. Most fuels contain carbon, hydrogen, or oxygen, like wood, peat, and charcoal. Fuels that only have carbon and hydrogen are what we call hydrocarbons. These are things like natural gas and petroleum, aka fossil fuels. Most fireworks use charcoal as a fuel. Living things use glucose as a fuel. Now, most of all the energy on Earth comes from the sun. Plants transform light energy into glucose, which stores that energy. Cellular respiration is that process in the cells that releases chemical energy from these sugars and other carbon-based molecules to make ATP when oxygen is present. Now, all chemical reactions involve changes in energy, absorbing energy to break bonds or release energy to form new bonds. Now, activation energy is the amount of energy needed to start a chemical reaction, aka when a reaction releases more energy than it absorbs, we get exothermic reactions. Okay, so we release more energy exits the system, so it's exothermic. When this excess energy is given off as heat or light. When a chemical reaction absorbs more energy than it releases, we call it endothermic, right? It absorbs, or inside, endo, okay? Now, fireworks release energy all at once, but cellular respiration releases energy in small bursts. The fuel comes from the food that we eat. Kilocalories, or calories with capital C, measures the amount of energy in each macromolecule provides. Now, 1 calorie, one of the big C calories, is the amount of energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius. Okay, so when we're talking about calories like that you're eating in food, we're talking about the calories of the capital C. Okay, now digestion breaks down macromolecules into simple molecules like glucose. The stored energy is transferred to ATP and then used to power the body. Energy can also be released as heat. So we can see that, like our bodies radiate heat. Okay, that happens because we are eating and we're producing heat as we digest. Now, I want to talk about the differences between kilocalories and lowercase calories, because calories lowercase is a different term that you might see somewhere. Basically, the kilocalorie, the kcal, that's the kind that you'll see on the food labels. That's the kind we're familiar with. Little case calories are basically like, it takes like 1,000 of those to make one of the calories that you eat. Okay, so just understand that this is basically what it means. Okay, and so those are the separations there. Now, all living things store energy because resources may not always be available. Plants convert glucose into starch, which is stored in the chloroplast. Animals convert glucose into glycogen. Glycogen is like a fat molecule, it's sort of like an intermediary. It's sort of carbohydrate and a little bit of fat. It basically it's stored in the liver and the muscle tissues, and it holds on to the energy that we need. So if you are eating more food than you need, your body is storing that as glycogen, and then storing it in adipose tissue, which is your fat tissue, so that it can save it for a rainy day in case it needs it later. And so that's why people get fat. Okay. Now, select the correct terms to complete the statement about chemical energy. The chemical energy of food molecules provides the blank for cellular respiration. Food molecules are broken down, and the energy in their bonds is blank. This energy is transferred to blank and used throughout the body. Some energy is released as blank. So, all living things, the the chemical energy of food provides fuel for cellular respiration. Food molecules are broken down and the energy is in their bonds is released, and the energy is transferred to ATP, and then some of the energy is released as heat. So cellular respiration has two types. There's aerobic, which is the type with oxygen. Okay, it's the type that most eukaryotic organisms like ourselves use. It produces the most energy per glucose molecule. So this is why it's preferred by most organisms. Anaerobic respiration is a technique of cellular respiration that goes without oxygen. So this is ideal in places where oxygen is not present. Okay, it's not as efficient, but it still does the job. Now, some examples are lactic acid fermentation or alcoholic fermentation, which we'll talk about in a bit. First, we're going to focus on aerobic respiration. I want you to move the labels over the boxes to identify the inputs and outputs of cellular respiration that we've so far talked about. So we have glucose and oxygen going in, okay, energy and food and oxygen going in, and the fox is releasing carbon dioxide and water. Water comes out through our waste, urine. And then heat and ATP are generated in the process. The process that releases energy is exothermic by breaking down glucose and other food molecules in the presence of oxygen. So if you notice, this is the reverse of the photosynthesis equation. 6 O2s and 1 C6H12O6, which is glucose, makes 6 CO2, 6 H2O, heat, and ATP. Now, how does this equation represent the law of conservation of matter? That matter cannot be created or destroyed. And how does this equation represent the law of conservation of energy? That energy cannot be created or destroyed. So, for the first one, there are equal numbers of each atom on both sides of the equation. So, because of that, it's balanced. Matter is not getting created or destroyed in this case. For energy, the energy from the sun makes the glucose, right? So energy from the sun goes to plants, plants make the glucose, and then that's released to make ATP and heat when we process it during cellular respiration. So all that energy is just getting moved and transferred. It's not being created or destroyed. Cellular respiration happens in the mitochondrion, which is a singular word for mitochondria, which is a plural. Okay, this releases the energy needed to make ATP through digestion and cellular respiration. Now, both animal and plant cells have mitochondria because they both do cellular respiration. Plant cells are the only ones who have the chloroplast. Now, the mitochondria has an inner membrane with a lot of folds. These are called cristae. The whole point of it is to increase the surface area because on the cristae is where cellular respiration happens. So the more surface area they have of membrane, the more cellular respiration that mitochondria can do. Now, the inner membrane is embedded with proteins, which are important in the electron transport chain. This is the last step of cellular respiration. We'll talk about that in a bit. Inside the inner membrane is the matrix, which is a gel-like substance where glycolysis occurs. We'll talk about all these parts in 1 second. Now, I want you to move the labels over the boxes to identify the inputs and the outputs of cellular respiration on this diagram. So you're going to move some so that you can complete photosynthesis and then move some to complete cellular respiration. So if you do this correctly, you'll have the reactants for photosynthesis, which are CO2 and H2O, as we've talked about. And then the products are going to be O2 and C6H12O6, which is glucose. And then, conveniently, the reactants are going to be the same thing as the products, glucose and oxygen, and the products will be CO2 and H2O. The whole point is that this is a cycle, okay? The trees take CO2 and H2O, make food and oxygen. We then eat those things, and we make CO2 and H2O, so the trees have something to consume. So almost all energy for living things comes from photosynthesis, either directly or indirectly. Producers or plants, they absorb sunlight to make food. Consumers eat the food and we get the energy for our growth and reproduction. Now, both producers and consumers do cellular respiration. Photosynthesis stores energy. Cell respiration releases it as heat and energy. ATP and heat. Okay, cellular respiration helps organisms maintain stable body conditions. So this releases energy to do cell processes. It helps maintain body temperature. Now, the bonds in food molecules and oxygen just reform into new molecules. They transfer energy to ATP. ATP is the cell's energy currency, which means any organelle in the cell can use ATP and it works. Okay. Now, I want to talk about glycolysis. Glycolysis is the first step in making ATP. It takes glucose, the sugar, and breaks it down into a compound that the mitochondria can use. Now, this happens in the cytoplasm of the mitochondria, so inside that matrix. Okay, the anaerobic process that breaks one glucose molecule in basically makes pyruvate, which is that molecule the mitochondria can use, two NADH molecules and two ATP molecules. These are both energy carriers. Okay, they hold on to that energy until the cell needs it. Now, pyruvate is then delivered into the membranes of the mitochondria. Okay, we go into the Krebs cycle, which is the second stage of cellular respiration, or the first set of reactions in cellular respiration. Basically, it's the Krebs cycle. It's also known as the citric acid cycle. Okay, the point of this is to break down pyruvate and make ATP. Now, the high energy electrons are transferred from the carbon bonds in pyruvate to the electron transport chain, okay, which is the third step. So the whole point is that we're forming NADH and FADH2 using this energy from these carbon bonds, okay? This is an aerobic process because it requires oxygen to do. For every turn of the cycle, this citric acid cycle, Krebs cycle thing, forms 1 ATP, 3 NADH, 1 FADH2, and 2 CO2. So if you look at this way, okay, we start with pyruvate entering the mitochondria, okay? Pyruvate combines with something called coenzyme A to make acetyl-CoA. We then have, and in the process, we make 1 CO2 and 1 NADH, which is right here, okay? We use the bonds of breaking pyruvate to make NADH and a CO2, and then we combine it with coenzyme A to make acetyl-CoA. Okay, then we basically turn acetyl-CoA into citric acid. There's no things coming in or out. We just rearrange things. Then we release some carbon dioxide. We make an NADH with some energy, and we break that citric acid cycle, which is citric acid, which is 6 carbons, down to 5 carbons. And that 5 carbon compound then releases more CO2. So we take off another carbon. We make more NADH. We actually make an ATP. And then it's a 4 carbon compound. Then we go ahead and take more energy out of it, okay, because we want to make 3, I believe. We want to keep 4, but we want to remove energy from it. So we remove some energy, we make FADH2 and an NADH. So by the end of it, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, total NADH. This process right here creates 3, and we have 1 FADH2, and we've got 1, 2, 3 CO2. Okay, but 2 in this part. All right, I fixed it, so the 3 NADH was there. Okay, so Krebs cycle, right? Energy in the chemical bonds of carbon-based molecules is what? When those bonds are blank. In the process, high energy blank are transferred to molecules such as FADH2 and blank. Okay, so if we go here, we have the energy in the chemical bonds of carbon-based molecules is released, then those bonds are broken. In the process, high-energy electrons are transferred to molecules such as FADH2 and NADH. So the second stage of third stage of cellular respiration is similar to the ETC of photosynthesis. The whole point is we have embedded proteins in the inner membrane of the mitochondria in eukaryotes. In prokaryotes, this is just in the regular cell membrane of the cell. And NADH and FADH2 carry the energy from the Krebs cycle into this electron transport chain. Okay, every time an electron is transferred into this, the energy is released. So basically, we have the NADH, it gives an electron, and the hydrogen ions go out into the intermembrane space, and we make NAD+. And same thing with FADH2, and the same thing here, right? And so in the process, all those hydrogen ions are combining with oxygen to make water. So that's how that water is made. And the electrons go down the chain until they come here, where because there's a buildup of the hydrogen ions outside of the matrix, basically the ATP synthase then is forced to pull it in, and in the process we make ATP. So the proteins take the high energy electrons from NADH and FADH2. The electrons transfer from protein to protein. Each time 2 electrons are passed down the chain, one hydrogen ion moves into the intermembrane space, which is right here where ions start to build up. And that pressure eventually forces the hydrogen ions into the matrix of the mitochondria, which creates that concentration gradient. Okay, and those gradients always try to find a balance. They always want to move from high to low concentration. So when that hydrogen ion builds up on one side, the ions want to move into the matrix. And as it moves through the ATP synthase, the protein adds phosphate ions to ADP, and we get ATP. Now, oxygen picks up the newly low energy electrons, those new things, and the hydrogen ions, and it makes water, which then comes out as waste. So basically the end goal of this, glycolysis makes a net gain of 2 ATP per cycle, per glucose molecule. The Krebs cycle and the ETC make a net gain of 36 ATP per glucose molecule. So without oxygen, only 2 ATP were made, and lipids and proteins, by the way, can be broken down to enter the Krebs cycle and the glycolysis too in a pinch if it's an emergency. Now, the total gain, because we have 36 from the ETC and Krebs cycle and 2 from glycolysis, the total gain per glucose molecule is 38 ATP. The 36 that we get from Krebs cycle and electron transport represent 38% of the total energy in glucose. The rest comes off as heat. So we're doing a Kahoot. All right, so anaerobic respiration. Early life on Earth originally evolved in an environment without oxygen. So what do? They use anaerobic respiration to produce energy. Most of this early life died off when oxygen flooded our atmosphere because it was toxic to them, but some still survive today. We can mostly see them in bacteria. They can live in places other organisms can't, like the deep ocean or really hot and acidic places without oxygen. And some organisms live in animal guts, like bifidobacteria, which are in our guts. So how are the processes of anaerobic and aerobic respiration similar, and how are they different? So both of them have different inputs and outputs, but they both make ATP. So different inputs and outputs, so that's what's different, but they both make ATP, which is the same. So your cells can't store large amounts of oxygen. You have to get it by breathing. When oxygen is not present, we stop breathing or we don't breathe enough. We need energy another way. We need to do fermentation. After glycolysis, which makes ATP and NADH, the fermentation process uses that NADH to make a steady supply of ATP. In the process, it removes the electrons to make NAD+, so that NAD+ can go back into the beginning and pick up more electrons. Because it doesn't use oxygen, fermentation is what we call anaerobic, or not in air respiration. There are 2 types of fermentation: alcoholic, which produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. This is performed by yeast and other microorganisms to make ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide. We can use it to make bread. For example, carbon dioxide makes bread rise, so that's why it's all puffy and light. And the alcohol evaporates in the oven when we bake it. And it's also used to make alcohol, like wine and beer and spirits. So basically what it does is after glycolysis, we have that pyruvate. So pyruvate plus NADH goes through the fermentation process, and we get alcohol, CO2, and NAD+. Lactic acid fermentation is a process that takes pyruvate and turns it into lactic acid. This happens in us. It occurs in our muscles during rapid exercise in order to make ATP, or by single-celled organisms as a waste product. The buildup of lactic acid in your muscles creates a burning sensation, and you can actually make your muscles feel sore after intense activity. So think about any time that you felt really, really sore, or you worked out a lot and you worked really hard. That's because you built up lactic acid in your muscles, and it started eating away at your muscles, so it hurts. Now, this process is used to make cheese, yogurt, buttermilk, sour cream, pickles, sauerkraut, and kimchi. The pyruvate and NADH get converted into lactic acid and NAD+. Now, why do your muscles do fermentation? Well, it's so we have energy when we're in danger. Like, your cells have a little ATP at any given time, but from glycolysis and cellular respiration. But there's only enough ATP for about a few seconds of intense activity. After that, lactic acid fermentation starts, which can produce enough ATP to last about 90 seconds, hopefully enough to get away from whatever is trying to kill you. Heavy breathing after exercise is a result of a buildup of carbon dioxide and a need for oxygen to restore the balance. So your body is trying to get rid of the carbon dioxide by breathing a lot and take in more oxygen so you can do more cellular respiration. Now, In order to exercise longer than 90 seconds, you need cellular respiration to keep making ATP. So that's why a lot of athletes pace themselves, especially marathon runners. Okay, cellular respiration takes longer to work. It takes longer than 90 seconds. So the body stores energy in muscle and tissues as the carbohydrate glycogen, right? It's usually about enough for 15 to 20 minutes of activity. After using up the glycogen, your body starts breaking down fat or other stored molecules for energy. So that's why oftentimes when you're trying to lose weight, doctors recommend doing at least 30 minutes of exercise a day, because the first 90 seconds get rid of that initial ATP. The 15 to 20 minutes get rid of your stored glycogen. And then after that, after about 20 minutes, you're starting to burn fat. So that's why it's better to do longer forms of exercise that involve running or walking or biking, things that sustain, that are longer, where you're doing continuous activity. All right, Kahoot. Wastewater is water that contains waste from homes, industry, and sometimes storm runoff. It can have chemicals, soap, food scraps, human waste. Wastewater treatment plants filter and treat water to make it clean enough to return to the city water supply or river, lakes, or oceans. It can also help water reservoirs in areas with a large human population or unpredictable droughts, like Los Angeles. Untreated wastewater can have bacteria or viruses that make us sick. They carry nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus that can lead to algae blooms, where those increased plants and algae decrease the dissolved oxygen and nutrient levels in the water, which would kill off fish and hurt ecosystems. They can carry heavy metals or toxic compounds that are poisonous to humans and animals, and they can pollute drinking water supplies and harm other industries that use that water. So once polluted, it's really difficult to remove pollutants from water or fix an affected ecosystem, and it's also really expensive. So the treatment process uses microbes to remove dissolved organic matter, things like waste and all kinds of stuff, from wastewater. So aerobic wastewater treatment uses oxygen. It's called secondary treatment. It uses large aerated tanks to mix the water. It gives more oxygen for the microbes inside the water to dissolve all those things. Tertiary treatment is the next stage of that. It removes even finer particles and really disinfects the water, so it's super clean. Anaerobic water treatment is primary treatment. It takes bacteria to break down small particles. They use methane instead of CO2 to do cellular respiration. And after the larger solid wastes are filtered out, water goes to a sedimentation tank where the remaining solids sink to the bottom of the tank for digestion. The sludge that remains can be cleaned and used as fertilizer for non-food crops, or sterilized and used as compost.